banning people from dining in. But the shop's still catching footfall from delivery riders. One of the owners says business is better than expected.
We were warned that for us as a company, we earn about 10 to 30% of average revenue for a month. So we had to work backwards and plan our manpower accordingly. But over the last week, we've been getting more than 100 at least orders coming in for delivery.
If the trend continues, they may earn half of a typical month's revenue. Mr. Sufi says the goal isn't about making a profit now, but simply to keep the brand alive. To do that, they're operating 24/7 ahead of the Muslim month of Ramadan, a fasting period that'll require early morning meals. Mr. Sufi adds that their cash flow burden would be eased if they receive their rental rebates, but it hasn't materialized. Less than 200 meters away, this cafe has received its rental rebate, but it's grappling with muted demand.
Last week was really a dead zone, so we were not everybody's overbuying, so everybody's have groceries, so they are actually cooking at home. So even if you're talking about takeaways, it's miserable.
The cafe just extended its usual delivery service to customers island-wide. Ms. Marlena says this change in strategy has helped, but it's still an uphill battle.
Everybody's not fighting for the same pie because everybody's not offering delivery, everybody's cutting costs. We are fighting with everyone from hawker centre to restaurants to cafes and so on.
She adds the business is not sustainable if the circuit breaker period drags on. The Restaurant Association of Singapore emphasised that the food and beverage landscape here is highly varied. How well eateries do also depends on lots of factors, such as their location in the country and also what kind of cuisine they serve, and whether that aligns with traditional ideas of takeaway or delivery. The association added that many tenants are still eagerly awaiting their rental rebates, and it's urging landlords to act quickly.
Britain is likely to keep its COVID-19 lockdown in place into next month, with a warning that the peak of infection is yet to come. The harsh measures have hit the economy hard, with 1.4 million new welfare benefit claims being made so far. The country has recorded 717 new deaths, a slight decrease from the day before. The total death toll now stands at around 11,000. Scientists are scrutinising the effectiveness of the lockdown in curbing the virus spread. Ollie Barrett joins us live from London for more on this. Ollie, what are the scientists' opinions then about the lockdown?
Well, the government's scientific advisors up to this point have been saying that the peak of the outbreak has not yet passed and that it can't be until that point that any consideration is undertaken of how exactly and when exactly to ease the lockdown gradually. That said, they are starting behind closed doors to discuss some of the effects that the lockdown is having already on the economy, but also on people's health. This idea that the lockdown itself can contribute to mental health problems, to health issues as well, and potentially even fatalities. So all of this is going to be considered by these scientists in the round so that they can come up with new advice to the government about what kind of easing of the lockdown should be possible and in what order once the peak of the outbreak passes.
Are we expecting to see a plateau, a flattening of cases anytime soon?
Certainly, the scientific advisors to the government and the chief medical officer have been saying in recent days that they believe that they are beginning to see signs already of the data going in the right direction, or at least the curves starting to flatten when it comes to new cases, hospital admissions, people in intensive care beds, and fatalities too. Now, we are told constantly that it's the fatalities that will be the last to level off, but we have seen in recent days a reduction in the amount of people dying over a 24-hour period. Now, one caveat to that is that we've just come out of a holiday Easter weekend here in the UK, and we have seen over recent weeks that sometimes the reporting of fatalities at weekends can dip for various reasons. So we'll have to watch the data over the coming days, but it should be about now that the effect of the lockdown that Boris Johnson imposed 3 weeks ago starts to really feed into the numbers.
Thanks for that update. Ollie Barrett speaking to us from London. And still ahead, a closer look at how ASEAN leaders are dealing with COVID-19.
And North Korea fires multiple short-range cruise missiles into the sea.
Nothing like a bit of bling. I love all this, and I'm ready. I think it's quite impressive. It's like a king in the palace.
The UK government is expected to extend its lockdown this week, which will further add to the economic cost of the coronavirus outbreak in Britain.
On the next Asia First, we'll show you how the lockdown has hammered businesses and whether government assistance will be enough to cushion the impact.
In the Philippines, pageants can lead to fame and fortune.
You're treated like a president of a country. That's the closest we could get to royalty.
But what does it take to get that crown?
Tapos, nung nandun na kami, sinabi na 3 million for a one-night stand.
Undercover Asia investigates the dark side of Philippines pageant craze. Saturday on CNA.
Siapa nama kamu? Di mana awak tinggal?
These are two very simple questions, but they meant a lot in the 1950s, the late 1950s and the 1960s, particularly because this was a period of Malayanization.
所以政府当时就认为要有一个共同的语言，在那个时期，大家都有一股学习马来文的那种意愿。
There's still apprehension on how the one country, two systems political system will continue to evolve. But it's the resilience of the people, holding on to their culture proudly and strong institutions, all help to make Hong Kong what it is today, and the hope of a better tomorrow. Roland Lim, CNA, Hong Kong.
Our top story this hour. ASEAN leaders are joining forces with China, Japan and South Korea to fight COVID-19. The leaders have come together in a joint video link-up hosted by Vietnam. China has also promised to send 100 million masks and other urgently needed supplies to the region. And more on the ASEAN summit from Associate Professor Simon Tay. He's chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. Thanks for joining us this evening. Firstly, ASEAN ministers are proposing a COVID-19 ASEAN Response Fund. What does that aim to do?
Well, I think that there are very diversities of funding from different countries. And I think funding the overall project plus the cross-border issues, I think these are some good uses for fund. It also shows solidarity. You know, ASEAN is supposed to be a community working together. Funding it is a good sign.
So, Prof, how effective will it be for future crises going forth then?
I think we must be very realistic, Glenda. The primary mechanism will still be the countries. It depends on which country can do what for its own citizens. But at the second level, I think ASEAN can contribute. There are many cross-border movements of people, of goods and services. Supply chains are critical, especially for the medical equipment, food and other essentials. And I think it's great news that ASEAN is coming together and trying to address these issues.
Now, we see a strain on healthcare systems and supply chains, as you mentioned, globally. As the number of COVID-19 cases around the world continues to rise, what are some of the most pressing issues then that ASEAN will have to address?
There is a global shortage of medical equipment, test kits and ventilators. Even Europe and America are fighting over them. I think this will be a big challenge for the smaller countries of ASEAN. We need to work with partners. It's a very good sign that not just ASEAN members, but China, Japan, and South Korea have been invited and took part in this summit. It's them who have the manufacturing capabilities. Of course, ASEAN must gear up and share equipment, but bringing these larger Northeast Asian giants in will be a very important factor going forward, given the experience with the disease and the manufacturing abilities.
Well, this pandemic has also affected the economies quite badly. So what can ASEAN governments collectively do to make sure that their economies can survive this outbreak?
That's a very good question, Glenda. I think that one of the key parts to remember is that the ASEAN plus these Northeast Asian three was created in a response to the Asian financial crisis back, when most of you were kids. And in that time, it played a very important role and created a lot of the financial instruments for stability and the monitoring system. And I think this in particular, the economic and financial flows that go across the region, will be a great contribution for ASEAN to work together with large countries. And I think at some point, we must also bring in Australia, New Zealand, and other friends in the region.
So would you say it's also critical then for ASEAN to work together closely, particularly now?
I think it's a bit overdue, actually. ASEAN countries have really been behind the curve in recognizing the problem. The numbers in Singapore are quite high, but in other countries, the numbers are artificially low because the testing has not been thorough enough. And the numbers were going to go up. In Indonesia, we expect the numbers to keep climbing until perhaps May, even into June. And this will be problematic and cause alarm. But the good news is that by ASEAN coming together, it shows that all the countries are now trying to get together, find ways to work together, and also bring in these other partners. It's a good sign what happened today.
Prof, you mentioned there about the testing. So what do you think are specific steps that ASEAN will need to take in order to help in the global fight against COVID-19?
Well, it will move fronts. You see, it started off in China and Asia, then moved to the West. And I think the next wave, the danger is that it will move to developing countries, of which many of the countries, our ASEAN neighbors, are developing countries. In these countries, the resources of hospital care, testing are just too thin. The populations are too large and dispersed, unlike small Singapore. And we see this now, particularly with the Water Festival in Thailand, in Myanmar. Many people are traditionally returning home. Though they've stopped the partying, this movement within the country can also cause problems. So really, this is where ASEAN must really try to help each other, exchange notes, figure out how to trace. Singapore, with its strengths of size and also technology, can help. This trace together Bluetooth software we've developed, I think, can be help to other countries on a very practical level.
All right, thank you very much for speaking to us and sharing your perspective tonight. We've been speaking with Associate Professor Simon Tay, Chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. Malaysia is cracking down on those who flout lockdown measures. So starting tomorrow, offenders will be charged in court instead of just being fined. Authorities say that they've made the move after seeing people continue to defy the movement restrictions. Senior Minister Ismail Sabri says offenders do not see the fine of 1,000 ringgit as a high amount, so they will let the court decide on the punishment. First-time offenders could be jailed for 2 years. Repeat offenders could face up to 5 years behind bars. And the move comes as the country continues to battle the coronavirus. 170 new cases have been reported, along with 5 more deaths. The national tally is now nearing 5,000. The death toll, 82. Malaysia is one of the region's worst-hit countries.
Australia and New Zealand have brushed aside calls to ease safe distancing measures, despite some success in flattening the COVID-19 curve.
New Zealand's restrictions on movement will remain intact, even as the country sees fewer new infections each day. It's recorded just 17 new cases of the virus, bringing the total to 1,366. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern cautioned against squandering efforts made over the past 20 days.
This is likely to be the most challenging week we face in lockdown, as we see the beginnings of success in terms of getting the virus under control and numbers coming down, sitting alongside an increase in the number of deaths. Over the weekend and today, I have seen some commentary that is not unexpected, Commentary that reflects our success to date in stamping out the virus as reason enough to take our foot off the pedal. It is not. As the Director General said, we are successfully over the peak. That is not the same thing as being out of the woods.
The country's 4-week lockdown is due to end next Wednesday. Lawmakers will meet before that to decide whether to ease restrictions. New Zealand's borders remain closed to foreigners, and returning residents must serve a 2-week quarantine. Neighbouring Australia has no plans to lift restrictions yet either. Prime Minister Scott Morrison says Australia is still many weeks away from easing up. He notes how other countries saw initial success against COVID-19, but later had a surge in new cases. Australia registered just 63 new cases, bringing the total number to 6,366. It was the lowest 2-day increase in a month.
And still to come on Asia Tonight, the IMF cuts global growth forecasts.
And a sing-along at home with Singapore's first virtual choir.
We are now at a critical phase in our fight against the virus.
This is actually a test of everything that we've been planning and preparing for all this while.
Are you feeling very breathless now?
Yeah.
Okay, don't worry.
Our frontline staff are working extremely hard to keep Singapore going.
The numbers may surge, but it is our responsibility to ensure that every patient is given the best standard of care.
We are fighting for a greater purpose, not just for ourselves.
I don't want these infections to spread, and I don't want my family members to get infected.
They have shown me the fragility of life and the important need to preserve it.
It's not time to give up. We must all continue to soldier on.
Courage, premiering 28th April on CNA.
After a brief hiatus, pirates have returned to wreak havoc in the region.
They are very well coordinated. They have a method to their madness.
We're not going to tolerate about this one. We're not going to give them room to maneuver in this area.
With the global economy taking a turn for the worse following the COVID-19 outbreak, will it fuel more attacks on ships in the region? Piracy attacks in Southeast Asia. Insight, Thursday on CNA.
From top stories,
multiple parts of Singapore were plunged into darkness,
to policy changes that impact you,
we should empower those with mental health conditions,
and insights into local and global markets. Get the latest news from in and around Singapore.
The clock is ticking.
In a grueling 5-hour-long cross-examination, this bacteria is found in 1 in 3 humans.
Singapore Tonight, daily on CNA. Japan Hour, Saturday on CNA. Japan Hour is brought to you by Sumitomo Corporation, ANA, and SMBC.
The International Monetary Fund has slashed forecasts for almost all countries and regions in its latest World Economic Outlook. And the IMF estimates growth will contract sharply to -3%. While the global economy could stage a partial recovery next year, the IMF cautions that growth rates will be below the pre-virus trend. Now, starting with the US, the world's biggest economy and currently the epicenter of the outbreak, its economy may shrink 5.9% this year. For Europe, excluding the UK, growth is likely to contract to a negative 7.5%. China, the world's biggest or second biggest economy, could see growth of 1.2% this year. It's according to the IMF. That is a sharp drop from 2019's 6.1%. Despite the gloomy forecast, though, the IMF says there are still reasons for optimism. It cites that the falling number of new cases in countries with major outbreaks and the pace of work on treatments and vaccines. Now, for more on this, Simon Marks joins us from Washington, D.C. Simon, the figures are grim, no getting away from that, and the IMF says it could even get worse.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, they appear to be open to all eventualities here. The chief economist of the IMF, Geeta Gopinath, is on her feet here in Washington, D.C. right now, presenting this World Economic Outlook. And the current projection that the IMF is making is that for the rest of 2020, global GDP is going to shrink to -3%. That is a substantial revision of previous forecasts. And she said just a few minutes ago that this is going to make the Great Lockdown the worst recession since the Great Depression. This is a truly global crisis. No country will be spared. However, she said that these projections are based on the current pattern of countries engaged in lockdowns, containing the virus and preventing it from spreading, and containing the possibility of a second wave. She did concede that the IMF has looked at other possible models in which that turns out not to be the case, and therefore, of course, the damage to the global economy will be even greater. But this is a very grim picture that she's presenting here this morning.
All right, so with this grim picture, what do these forecasts spell for us then?
Well, very, very hard times ahead. I mean, the light at the end of the tunnel is the possibility that, provided the world comes out of all of this, in 2021, global growth will rebound to 5.8%. But she says, look, that is still below the level that growth was anticipated to be in 2021. So under any circumstances, countries all over the world are taking a hit. Her argument, the IMF's argument, is that countries need to engage in defensive spending by putting money into their healthcare systems right now. Also, of course, by offering the kind of bailouts that we've seen all over the world to families and small businesses, making attempts to try and allow them to bridge this crisis in their own individual ways. But the message from the International Monetary Fund as this meeting gets underway here in Washington, D.C., is that it is impossible for any country and for any family and for any business to escape the impacts of all of this. And it's going to require, they've been arguing over the last half an hour, very, very concerted global activity and consensus among countries about how precisely to approach this challenge if the absolutely worst case scenarios are to be headed off.
Yes, Simon, does look like a very bleak picture. Is there any cause or any glimmer of hope for some optimism?
Well, the chief economist at the IMF said that she hoped that vaccines may emerge sooner than anticipated, and that therapeutics, as we know, were already showing some positive signs in terms of treating the virus. She said there are some hopeful signs that this health crisis will end. Countries, of course, are succeeding in containing the virus, and she's announced that the IMF is going to allow its $1 trillion lending facility to be used, so that indebted countries are offered either a continuation of existing moratoria on debt repayments or concessional financing to help them come through all of this. I mean, I suppose the ultimate silver lining in the cloud is that the IMF seems pretty determined at this point that the world is going to come through this. It's really a question of measuring the economic damage over the short term as countries all over the world find their path towards the avenue for recovery.
Yes, a long road ahead for all of us. Thanks very much for that. Simon Marks speaking to us from Washington.
Indonesia's central bank is keeping its key interest rate steady. It says the current level is in line with efforts to ensure market stability, but it has cut the amount of cash banks must keep in reserve to pump liquidity into the financial system. BI is keeping the key rate steady at 4.5%, and it's also leaving its overnight deposit facility and lending facility rates unchanged. The central bank has trimmed the benchmark rate twice this year on top of 4 cuts last year. And Governor Peri Warjio says there's still room for a cut if need be. The Indonesian rupiah has been a losing proposition among Asian currencies. It fell by 18% from its last peak in January to hit almost 17,000 to the dollar in mid-March. It has pared some of its losses, though, and is currently selling at just over 15,500 to the dollar.
Domestic flights will remain suspended in Vietnam. This comes as government officials discuss extending the 15-day safe distancing order, which is set to end tomorrow. Local airlines will not be able to sell tickets for flights from April the 16th. Vietnam has imposed curbs on flights and adopted nationwide control measures to curb the spread of COVID-19. The country's early action and extensive testing have kept infection numbers low. Vietnam has confirmed 265 infections.
Smartphone sales in China recovering. Last month, 21 million handsets were sold, including 2.5 million iPhones. Sales figures are almost 3 times what they were in February, though still down roughly 20% last year. So for Chinese retailers, it was mostly business as usual in March. And companies like Apple, now they're hoping a rebound in China will cushion declines in other markets.
Let's get more on one of our top stories this evening. With India extending its nationwide lockdown until next month, let's take a look at just how big an impact the restrictions could have.
अगर ये 21 दिन नहीं संभले तो देश और आपका परिवार 21 साल पीछे चला जाएगा.
On March 24th, Prime Minister Narendra Modi ordered the world's largest lockdown with just 4 hours' notice, and panic was in full display in the country of 1.3 billion people. The unprecedented shutdown shuttered businesses, putting millions of informal workers out of work. And with no money, migrant labourers decided to flee the major cities and return to rural villages, sparking the greatest exodus in India since the 1947 partition. There was mayhem at train and bus stations as authorities struggled to control the massive crowds. Several rounds of tear gas were fired and hundreds were detained after clashes broke out. But not everyone made it home. Some were stranded after all transport was stopped.
लॉकडाउन हो गया, सारे लोग फंस गए, घर जा नहीं पाए. सबसे बड़ी समस्या तो ये है कि साहब मान लीजिए हम तो यहाँ परेशान हैं, घर पे खेती बाड़ी नहीं कटेगी तो लोग क्या खाएंगे, क्या पिएंगे, बाल बच्चे 2-4 परिवार सबके हैं घर पे. तो बोले कि ठीक है, अब उसका इंतजार क्या करो, सब छोड़ छाड़ के जैसे हो यहाँ आ जाओ. लॉकडाउन खुले, पैसा को छोड़ो, हम अपना एक साथ रहेंगे, सभी बाल बच्चे एक साथ रहेंगे, जो भी होगा देखा जाएगा.
Others decided to make the journey back on foot, trekking hundreds of kilometers while battling hunger and fatigue. And that turned a pandemic lockdown into a tragedy. At least 20 people have died while walking home. Apart from the humanitarian cost, India is also counting the economic cost. Experts say the country's frail economy would take a further hit, and it could face a major unemployment crisis. Critics have also slammed the first stimulus package unveiled by the government, a $22 billion package, which is about 1% of India's GDP. And the longer the lockdown, more people will be pushed into poverty.
Unless and until their work starts, till then they are vulnerable, unless and or they go back home.
For India's poorest, many fear that hunger will kill them before the coronavirus does.
North Korea has fired several suspected cruise missiles towards the Sea of Japan. The back-to-back launches from the ground and air are the most high-profile among a series of weapons tests that North Korea has conducted recently amid stalled nuclear talks. Our correspondent Lim Yong-suk has more.
Well, it seems like North Korea had a very busy morning because what we are learning is that North Korea is believed to have fired several rounds of the cruise missiles very early this morning at about 7 a.m. local time. They were firing them for about 40 minutes and they flew about 150 kilometers from the Korean peninsula to Japan. But we're also hearing that North Korea also fired some of those air-to-surface missiles too. We're not sure exactly how many, but it seems like North Korea were firing them too, together with those cruise missiles. Now, the South Korea's military says that they are analyzing the situation with the United States and that South Korea's military remains on alert and is prepared for any kind of provocative acts or more provocations that North Korea may take today or in the coming days.
Now, before we go this hour, more than 900 people have come together to form Singapore's first virtual choir.
I will always recall the city, know every street and shore, still down the river which brings us life, winding through my Singapore.
From their homes in more than 20 countries, they've recorded videos of themselves singing an all-new choral arrangement of Singapore's favourite song, Home. It's all to encourage one another during the COVID-19 pandemic.
This initiative is actually demonstrative of the resilience of Singapore, and that was what we really wanted to bring out as a country that brings together Singaporeans from all across the world to come together to support each other during this time. And it really demonstrates a huge support network, and especially giving Singaporeans who are still overseas an opportunity to be closer to home with music that is close to home, Singaporean music.
Led by Voices of Singapore and supported by the Singapore Tourism Board, the project has participants from Singapore and as far